Hylozoism has sort of two definitions. The first definition is that there's no such thing as inorganic anything. Because you see, if it is true that there's only one thing, one fundamental reality, and that's the one life, and that one life is manifesting in and as form, if there's only one thing, really, then how could anything escape the embrace of that one life? So that's why even the stones we walk upon must have the element of life teeming within them if we could but understand how to see it or understand it. So that's definition one, that nothing can escape life. Therefore, there's nothing really technically inorganic. That idea of organic and inorganic is far more arbitrary than we realize. The second definition is perhaps more important here, and that is, this gets into what I was saying earlier about magnitudes of life, that every unit of life is nested within a greater unit of life, which is nested within yet a larger unit of life ad infinitum. And that, for instance, a good example would be, I like to use the example, if I take a cell in my finger, that cell is considered an entity. It's a unit of consciousness. Now, of course, its magnitude of consciousness is infinitesimal, and so much less than such other categories of consciousness that we might think about, but nonetheless, it's an entity. And by the way, if you've ever studied cellular biology, it's not that hard to imagine. I mean, a cell is a miraculous thing. But it's nonetheless just a cell within a larger entity that I would call myself. And yet I and everybody, all of us, are just cells within a vaster entity, and that entity is humanity itself. And from the esoteric point of view, humanity is one being, one entity, and it has a soul, and it has a personality, and as I've said earlier, those two can come into conflict with each other and cause great problems, as we see in the world today. But nonetheless, humanity is one entity, and yet it too is just a unit within a vaster entity, and we call that entity the planetary logos, the entity that ensouls the entire planet, and that kingdoms of nature are just the outpicturing of layers of its consciousness. And that the human kingdom plays a very unique role because the human kingdom represents the throat chakra to that entity. And I'm always, whenever I think about that, it gives me pause because, you know, imagine that the entire sum total of all human consciousness is nothing but this vibration to that entity. And yet, so we could call the planetary logos a god to us, and yet it too is a mere cell within a vaster entity, and that's the solar logos, the entity that ensouls the whole solar system. And to the solar logos, planets represent chakras to it. And yet the solar logos is also a unit within a much vaster entity, and that entity we often call the one about whom naught may be said. It's said to be a cosmic entity that embraces 7 stars in our local cosmos, and our star, our sun, is said to be the heart chakra to that entity. And yet you can go much higher. We can skip this and go all the way up to a galaxy. You know, it is now believed that the Milky Way galaxy has 150 billion stars. That's 150 billion solar logi, and yet that in its totality is one entity. That's a galactic logos. And by the way, we also know that there are now millions of known galaxies. So that's Hylozoism. And every unit that's contained within a larger unit, it is influenced by the thoughts of that larger unit, and those thoughts from that larger unit are experienced by that lesser unit as a law or a principle of living.
There's the idea that very often we can use an image to describe what happens in this process of coming into being and going out. You have a drop of water, which we think of as ourselves. That drop of water falls onto a body of water, the drop and the ocean essentially become one. There is no difference. The consciousness of one shares in the consciousness of the other. So there's this idea that each and every seemingly individual life form actually shares in the life of this greater whole. Now, really, we have this idea of ourselves, which is not too hard to grasp, which is that within every human body there are however many trillions of cells. So every body has 3, 4, 8 trillion different individual lives that compose this thing I call me. We don't have a problem with grasping that. It becomes a little bit more challenging when we think of ourselves as perhaps those same sort of cells within some greater body. If, in this imaginary example, a cell in our body were to have the thought that, there's something greater that I'm a part of, and maybe as a little stomach cell, maybe I can come to understand something about this greater life that I'm embodied in. You'd say that that's a spiritual cell, a cell that is somehow turning toward an esoteric understanding. Obviously, the example's a little bit ridiculous, but in our case, one of the beauties of the coming to a stage of actually being a human being, and particularly a human being who has had some sense of an awakening, that's exactly what occurs, where we try to understand what is this greater life that we're a part of, and how do we fit in, and the natural sort of awareness that comes about that the greater functioning of the greater life is that which improves the functioning of myself as an individual and of those around me. So this is a sort of balance that is always the attempt of the person who has had some sense that there's something more. And it constitutes the difference between what you could call an esoteric and an exoteric approach to just the basic process of living.